So welcome, Steve. It's so great to see you here on such an eventful day as well for everyone across the globe. For Jellyfish, though, the most important item on the agenda is, of course, our conversation on transhumanism and the future of humanity. I don't want to speak much for you, so please introduce yourself, your incredible work, your authorship, and all that you've done for the transhumanist space.
Well, look, so first of all, I should say I'm at the University of Warwick in the UK. I'm a professor of social epistemology, which is a field that I founded, and it has to do with the social foundations of knowledge, looking at it not only from the standpoint of how it's been historically and empirically, but also how it should be in the future. So it has a kind of policy orientation, you might say. And it's in this context, so I've written over 25 books. In this context, over the years, I've become increasingly interested, you might say, not just in the character of knowledge, but in the character of the knower. And this has moved me increasingly in the direction of looking at the future of humanity and what the shape of the future of humanity is, and especially given that we now have a sort of proliferation of options, you might say, that have been brought about through science and technology. And they're usually summarized as, transhumanism and posthumanism. And so a lot of my recent work has been devoted to that. And I've, generally speaking, talked about this kind of development as the emergence of Humanity 2.0. Which was the title of a book I published back in 2011, and I've published several since then that have sort of touched on this topic, and I guess this is the sort of thing that we'll be exploring here in the conversation today.
Absolutely, yes. So actually, in the run-up to our discussion, we drew a questionnaire for our community, trying to see where everybody stands in terms of what transhumanism means for them. And to be honest with you, I expected everybody to say that transhumanism means cyborgs with Neuralink implants, controlling everything telepathically, which I must admit is where I stand a little bit. But no, to my surprise, the majority have said that transhumanism means self-enhancement through supplements, through medicines that can control our biology and evolution artificially. And so following on from that, we opened the floor to the community, asking what questions they might want to pose to you during our discussion. And I think that I thought of using these questions as a starting point and delving into the details as the conversation flows. So I think that the most popular question that popped up was what transhumanism means for you, your motivations behind entering the space, and why you yourself are a transhumanist.
Okay, well, so first of all, I suppose I am a transhumanist, though I think a lot of the sort of hardcore members of the community might have their doubts about me, because I sort of justify it and think about it in a somewhat different way, and maybe this will come out subsequently with some of the other discussion that we have. But basically, I think of transhumanism as, so one thing I agree with most transhumanists about transhumanism is that it is a kind of natural progression from the way in which science and technology has already transformed the human condition. Okay? So insofar as we are already living much longer than our ancestors did, and we live under radically different circumstances, and we communicate and do things in radically different ways than we did even, let's say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, let alone thousands of years ago. There's a sense in which transhumanism is like the next step in that sense, right? So in other words, people who tend to be against transhumanism typically do tend to be people who in some sense think that this trajectory has been in some sense misguided or needs to be stopped or something like that. But I think transhumanism in this respect is not a particularly science fictional or fantasy way of thinking about things. It's rather kind of a natural progression of the trajectory that we're already on. So I accept that. another thing that I accept about transhumanism, which I think a lot of people who are transhumanists maybe don't accept, is that there's a sense in which a lot of the particular ways in which the sort of issues and projects and visions that people have about transhumanism, especially issues having to do with the potential for immortality and resurrection and all of these things are very strongly theologically based. Okay. And I think if it weren't, and especially within the Abrahamic theological tradition, by which I mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which share in common a kind of privileged understanding of the human being in the cosmos. So, in other words, there's something about the human, right? And often it gets discussed in terms of being created in the image and likeness of God, that then licenses all of these kinds of radical moves that human beings have done to themselves, right, over the course of millennia and are continuing to do, which have involved radical transformation of not just our bodies, but also of the environment and everything else. And so the question then becomes, what licenses you to do this? Why do you think you can get away with doing this, right? And that has a lot to do with the self-understanding of the human being, I would say, as having been created in the image and likeness of God. So that there is a theological underpinning to this, like it or not, that in a sense motivates and kind of rationalizes what transhumanism is doing. Because I would say that if nothing else, the transhumanist project is a highly risky project. Right? It is about taking risks. It is about imagining, in a way, even if we're just talking about something like radical life extension, that actually changes a lot of things very quickly. Right? Even though we're still in our biological bodies, and even if we don't look very different from how we look now, the fact that we might be lasting in these bodies for hundreds or thousands of years changes just about everything about the social order. Okay? And we can discuss that in more detail. But the point is, it's very radical, it's very risky. And then the question becomes, what makes you think you can get away with it? What makes you think you can succeed at this? And that's where I think the theology really matters a lot. And I find that very interesting because generally speaking, I think theology has been a very strong motivating force in the development of science and technology, even before we get to transhumanism. And that point there is not a particularly controversial point, I think, from the standpoint of people who study the history of this stuff. So all of that is very attractive, I would say. And I would also say that we do live in a time where so many of the taken for granted views, whether we're talking about gender, right, or we're talking about, government or the economy, everything's up for grabs. And in a sense, transhumanism flourishes in that kind of environment where there's a kind of radical uncertainty about how the future is going to be. And so in that respect, transhumanism is very much a kind of ideology of our times. So all of that I think is very appealing. And I can tell you that, when I teach this stuff to students, it's very appealing to them, at least at that level, right? And then once we start to get into some of the details, which we probably will, about various transhumanist positions and things like this, well, then you get disagreements, okay? But I think if we're talking about the fundamentals in this way, I'm very much on board with it.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. I must admit, I haven't thought much before about the theological justifications behind drives for enhancement that we've witnessed throughout the scope of human history. So thank you very much for that. That's incredibly insightful. And so considering the way that transhumanism is going to look like over the next, say, 100 years, when there's no longer survival of the fittest, but rather artificial control over our own evolution, I wonder what sort of policy could regulate these advancements, as there's no precedent for them in the whole of human history. And you rightly say they have the potential to radically transform the social order. And as they can for the better, so they can for the worse, in my reasoning implying mass intrusive surveillance, social divide, perhaps the potential to create malicious beings. And so my question is, in your teachings and in your work, what sort of avenues do you explore policy might take in regulating these developments of transhumanism in the future?
Well, there are a lot of things here. So let's look at the surveillance thing briefly, because that's something that's already very much in the horizon with regard to the amount of information that the big tech platforms already take from us, for purposes of advertising and things like this, and sometimes, in some countries, the government is actually taking some of this data as well, and we're just, in a sense, freely giving it away to them. So, in a sense, we don't even need to have silicon chips planted in our brains. We're sort of already voluntarily, on a regular basis, right, giving up data, and that's an interesting That's an interesting point right there, because I think, in a sense, the question of surveillance sounds very scary when it's talked about as surveillance, but when it's seen as part of a contract where you're getting something in return, right? Namely, these functions, these services, these facilities, right, that you can access, free at the point of use, but in return, in an unobtrusive way, all sorts of data is being gathered about you, from your choices and from other things as well, and that then becomes kind of the basis of a kind of new sort of economy in a way, right? This kind of metadata economy that we're entering into, um, and you see, this I think is a very tricky thing, because I think in a way people have already given up. In a way, they've already accepted surveillance. Let's put it that way. They've already accepted surveillance as part of a contract deal where they're getting something in return. Okay, and of course, if you're going to start talking about, this is where the cyborg side of transhumanism becomes interesting, because with the cyborganization, of course, especially if it's very sophisticated, right, there probably will have to be some implants where there might be some third-party monitoring of how these implants are in fact working on our bodies, right? And so then the surveillance is potentially not only intrusive, but also has a kind of control function potentially in what we can do. And so that, I think, is a much more controversial thing. We're not really there yet, but that is something that I think will become very much part of legislation. But already we are in a position where we are voluntarily giving up a lot of data that is then being used to monitor and control our behavior. We're already voluntarily doing that. And so the editor of Wired magazine, Kevin Kelly, the founding editor of Wired magazine, right, proposed this idea of covalence, right? This was about 10 years ago in Wired magazine, one of the editorials. And covalence is basically the idea that it doesn't stop, let's say, Facebook or whomever from collecting data from you, but the point is that data has to be made available to you too. Right. So in other words, it doesn't become their private property. Right. In other words, because the data is coming from you, you too should be able to access it and do whatever you will do with it. Now, of course, Facebook may be able to do more with your data than you can with it. OK, given the nature of it, that's entirely possible. But at least you have access to it. Right. Because at the moment, basically, your data is being expropriated. Right. It's basically being taken without you being able to get it back. And here the idea would be you'd be sharing the data, right? And so this is proposed by the editor of Wired magazine, and it may come to something at some point. But it seems to me that's one issue, right? That's one issue where I think to a certain extent you might say the horse is already out of the barn, that in a sense we've already accepted a certain amount of surveillance in this kind of big tech world where we normally function. Now, if we're talking about larger issues of, directing evolution, right? And which was kind of how you led with the question. I think there's a kind of a lot of issues here, and within the transhumanist community, there is actually a lively debate, perhaps surprisingly lively, about whether we have enough people, too much people, or too few people, right? I mean, there's this kind of issue that's sort of there. Some weird, to my mind, a little bit weird population issue. And of course, because there are people like Elon Musk who thinks that civilization is going to die because we're not reproducing enough, right? I don't actually share this view. I think that when one thinks about directing evolution, it seems to me having a larger birth rate is not inherently wonderful. And I think it really causes a lot of problems, especially if you're going to, if you're anticipating that the people who are living now and in the future will be living longer. Okay, because one of the reasons why it was always very important to have population replacement on a regular basis was people weren't living very long. And so in order to keep the social structures going, you actually need to have replacements, right? Because people are only working for so long, they're only living so long, right? And so you do need the replacements. That's kind of the original idea. But if we're contemplating the idea of people living indefinitely, then it seems to me that you would expect that the number of children would drop, right? As people, in fact, are active longer. Right. And generally speaking, right, one of the ways in which we have been measuring social progress in the modern era, right, has been that, in fact, as countries become more productive and more stable and people are living longer and we have lower infant mortality rates and things like that, right, then the population rate growth declines. That's in fact been kind of a normal pattern. Right. And it's normal. And until recent times, it's been normally seen as a sign of progress, because what you're doing is you're beginning to get to a point where the population is sustainable with the environment. Okay. And I do think that is something that transhumanists actually do need to take more seriously, is the environmental impact, right, of this whatever the population is going to be. One has to remind ourselves that insofar as we're still talking about being on planet Earth, right, there is a serious environmental issue here. Okay, now guys like Elon Musk, who want to keep on populating forever, of course, they have a kind of escape strategy. There are these transhumanists who are, of course, very keen on populating other planets, right? And that's certainly part of Elon Musk's strategy. So in a sense, I can understand that if you're one of those kinds of transhumanists who basically thinks, that the project of transhumanism is about populating the cosmos, then the issue about the population growth rate doesn't matter so much. You could start, populating because you take the surplus people and you just send them to Alpha Centauri or something, right? And I think that's kind of what Musk has in mind, to be perfectly honest. But if you're thinking about a kind of transhumanism that is earthbound, at least for the foreseeable future, then I do think one needs to think in more sustainable terms. And that's why the issue of people having their lives extended, right, in a way rubs up against the idea of reproduction, right? And because the idea is that these old people aren't going to disappear, and now we're going to be adding new people on top of them. Right. And so that creates not only an environmental problem, of course, but it also creates problems of, society. Basically, intergenerational conflicts of all kinds can arise, right? Especially if these old people are so wonderfully healthy and everything that they keep their jobs forever. And as a result, the younger people don't have any way of getting, a foot on the job ladder.
True, that's a very logical argument. Maybe just to argue Elon Musk's side simply for the sake of playing devil's advocate, perhaps his motivations for incentivizing population growth are to enrich the diversity among the human species, subsequently increasing the amount of data that we output and share, from which we gain insights into our biology better, and also to spur creativity and innovation as a result of this increase of diversity of human intelligence. Or it is simply to put, a sort of strain on innovation by overpopulating the planet. Perhaps we will have no other choice than to relocate to Mars and all go buy stocks of SpaceX.
But I have a question about Elon Musk in this regard. Namely, I don't associate him with being one of the biggest supporters of the longevity side of transhumanism, though.
Oh, I don't know. What does he say on the subject?
No, but you would have. This is the point. It's not. It doesn't seem to be a big agenda item for him, and that may be part of the answer, right? Namely, I agree with you, and I think if that's Musk's argument, that's in fact a good argument. You know, the idea that you want generational turnover to increase the diversity, because in fact, it's through generational turnover that you usually get innovation and so forth. But then you don't want people living forever. Right. And I don't think, and as far as I know, I don't think Musk is one of those transhumanists who believe we should be living forever.
Perhaps, and of course, there's another aspect of transhumanism that's cognitive enhancement, which seems where Elon is taking his business.
Oh, no, but the point is transhumanists don't have to buy the whole menu, right? I mean, in a sense, right? And the priorities that are given to different agenda items in transhumanism may be different, right? And it is interesting that given how much transhumanists love to talk about longevity, right, that this is not Elon Musk's topic.
True. I certainly haven't heard Elon be as loud on the subject as others. But that actually brings us quite nicely to our second most popular question from the community, which was, how close do you think we are to attaining longevity escape velocity? In your lifetime?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, you know, one of the problems here is that already we are increasing the life expectancy, even if we're not repairing the telomeres and all that kind of stuff that Aubrey de Grey is into. I mean, so there's a sense in which we could already tell, right, from the time I was born. So next week I turn 65, okay, and so, you know, from the time I was born, it seems to me there's already been, it seems like an extra 20 years have been added. Okay, over the course of that's how it seems, and it's not because, you know, people have been taking, you know, fancy drugs or anything like that, but there's a sense in which we're cutting down the infant mortality rate, right? People are surviving diseases longer, vaccinations are helping in this regard, right? All of these kinds of what we would normally call normal developments in the history of medicine, right, that have come on stream in the second half of the 20th century, right, in a way have made people live longer and are healthier, and to be honest with you, you know, if we're talking, you know, transhumanism, you know, unless you're going to say, well, that's transhumanism too, right? That's also, you know, maybe, I mean, in a sense, transhumanism is a continuation of that, but this stuff was already happening before transhumanism, you know, became the movement that it is today, right? So then the question has become, what is the added extra? You know, what is the added extra of transhumanism to, as it were, this tendency already that's existing for people to be living longer and significantly longer, right? I mean, you know, what is transhumanism contributing to this trajectory, right? And so this is where, you know, one has to, I guess we're talking here about the primary research, right? The kinds of stuff that the Sense Foundation that Aubrey de Grey is part of, right, is trying to do with regard to repairing the telomeres so you can arrest or retard aging, right, at the genetic level. And I don't know. Okay, so the point is, I don't know. I don't know how close or how far we are with this. I mean, obviously, there's been some success with much lower organisms, you know, but if we're talking about human beings, we're not just talking about the restoration of relatively, you know, motor capabilities, but, you know, we've got issues like Alzheimer's and things having to do with brain deterioration, which come about through age, which is not going to be such a straightforward thing, I think, to deal with at the level at which you know, people like Aubrey want to deal with it. So, you know, this is why I would, you know, this is why, you know, you want to, you know, your people like to focus on the biological side of transhumanism. But frankly, I think if we wanted to talk about a radical transformation of the human condition coming from transhumanism, I think it's more likely that we'll get something like computer-based brain emulation, which will then be able to upload and then become, you know, kind of this super intelligence thing. I think that's much more likely, actually. I think that's much more likely a transhumanist future than the one that is very closely focused on enhancing, right, the biological body at the sort of basal level of genetics. That's my own personal view about this, though I understand you might say from the consumer standpoint of transhumanism, where people are always looking for a certain drug or a certain kind of diet, right? Or a certain kind of lifestyle, right? All the punters who go to all these transhumanist conferences, I can understand that they're very much oriented that way, and they don't find the idea, of a kind of uploaded consciousness or something nearly as sexy. But I do think, I think this biological stuff is much more speculative. I guess that would be what I would say. And certainly cryonics, my God, cryonics is in fantasy land, but that's
Well, I wouldn't say Fantasyland. The field has certainly attracted a lot of interest, and we were just hosting CryoDAO on our servers last week, and God, some of the insights that they've shared into their work is very impressive, and into the work of their researchers that they're sponsoring. They're certainly making quite significant breakthroughs.
One thing, I just want to say this, because I don't want to sound like a total naysayer. I think one of the strong points about cryonics is it's privately funded. Okay, right. So in other words, I would not put taxpayers' money in this, but nevertheless, if there are people who are very strongly motivated to do, to want to pursue this thing, this is what private funding is for. It is for these more exotic projects, right? Which in a sense, might take a long time to realize, might require very specialized kind of stuff that otherwise would not have any kind of purpose outside of that context, right? That is what private funding is for. And as long as cryonics, stays in the private sector, then fine, okay? And I think it's worth monitoring and worth looking at, so I wouldn't ban it, okay? But I am very struck by the amount of faith that people have in this stuff. I mean, I am very struck by it, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I think it's one of these lessons that social policy might take when considering regulation for, as you put it, these extravagant or exotic transhumanist projects, as opposed to more accessible transhumanist projects.
Yeah.
So sure, and as we were talking about longevity, escape velocity, I was just thinking that people, are always nowadays looking for this just one solution or one drug that's going to take them past longevity escape velocity. And I think it's with artificial intelligence, it's a bit like that as well, where people were looking for this one device, one breakthrough, that's going to take us past the singularity point.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things, I had one of my PhD students a few years ago wrote a book which basically was looking at transhumanism as a new social movement. And what that means in sociology is that he was looking at basically kind of the gatherings of transhumanists. So rather than just focusing on the Ray Kurzweils and the Aubrey de Greys and these sort of top line figures, right, what you would do is you'd look at the conventions where the transhumanists hang out, right, and talk to each other, and where they do have these kind of effectively exhibitions of new potential products, new drugs, right, attracting consumers and investors, right. There are these things. There's this thing called the RAD Festival in San Diego, right, that takes place every year, RAAD. You probably know about it, right? And it goes on for several days, and a lot of these big guys show up and give pep talks, basically. And they're basically showcasing what they regard to be kind of what's what's around the corner in terms of transhumanist drugs and things like this, and the student wrote a book on the back of this. His name is James McFarlane, and if you look at the kinds of products like you would get in goodie bags, like when you attend this conference, right? It has a lot of the feel of a combination of herbal remedies and diet pills. All right, it's kind of in that orbit. Right. Like you were mentioning, the one thing that you need to do to live forever. It's like the diet pill, right? I don't need to exercise. Right. I just take the pill and boom, obesity's over, and I do think that there is a kind of mentality, right, which is very much, in a way, it is very much drawn from a kind of very pro-science worldview, but perhaps one that has a little bit too much faith, that it could just solve it like that, right? A kind of magic science viewpoint, right? That there will be the one pill, that there will be the one drug, right? And then the stuff that you end up getting in the goodie bag, right, are just really pale. It's really kind of pale stuff. It's almost like fashion statements, you know? But nevertheless, it sustains the faith, right? It sustains the faith. And that's sometimes quite important, in terms of keeping publicity alive. Because look, you think about how many times Ray Kurzweil and Aubrey de Grey have pushed forward their predictions about when stuff's going to happen, right? I mean, every 10 years they're pushing it forward 5 years, and so you got to keep the faith going, right? You have to keep the faith going, and you also need to keep the investors going, right? And that's why, by the way, if you look at Ray Kurzweil's predictions about when the singularity is going to occur, right, they're always going to occur in his lifetime. Right, maybe at the very end of his lifetime, right? But nevertheless, right, that's why it's got to be something like in 10 or 15 years. Otherwise, he's not going to benefit from it. And I think a lot of the constituency for transhumanism, and this is another thing too about the demographic for it, right? There are a lot of older people who are very keen on it. Okay, a lot of people who regard themselves as very youthful and they don't want to deteriorate. And let's say they're something like my age and they're very active and they want to stay that way forever. And they got this great fear they're going to fall apart. And so they want salvation down the road within their reach. And so a lot of the investment in this stuff is very much predicated on a relatively short time frame, to get the escape velocity. Because if you're told, let's say by a scientist, well, yes, we will be able to repair the telomeres at this point, but frankly, it's probably going to take 100 years. You'll see investment collapse if it's 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a little as well to the theological drives that behind these transhumanist developments that we spoke about a little bit earlier. I think the latest that I heard from Ray was at the SXSW conference, where he spoke about the prospects of uploading our conscious to server or recreating the brain digitally, and talking about the timelines of that as being in the very near future. And of course, your work explores a lot about the human condition outside of the physical body. And so I'm interested if you could help me envisage that a little bit better. I mean, you spoke there about super intelligence as well. So what does that mean exactly, the human condition outside of the physical body?
Well, look, I think there's an issue here about what kind of if you're living forever, in what form are you living, right? And obviously, if you're going to entertain the idea of uploading your consciousness into a machine, and let's say we accept the notion of consciousness in a relatively unproblematic way. I mean, people like Kurzweil and Max Moore, for example, right? They do think of it as information, right? A certain kind of configuration of information, right? A unique configuration of information, you might say, that corresponds to each person. And there is actually in the history of Western philosophy, there is kind of precedent for that kind of view. John Locke, in his view of personal identity, he basically talks about personal identity's form as the continuity of memory. Okay, and you can think about the continuity of memory basically, as a kind of memory tape, right? That is continuous, and somehow you can then copy it, right, and upload it, and then you carry on from there, right? And I think this is the basic idea, and of course it's by no means the only notion of consciousness. But it is it does have certain kinds of advantages. Namely, it talks about an individual consciousness. So you imagine there's a unique memory tape for each person, right? And so each uploading is a unique uploading. And so I can buy all that, and that's okay. I mean, I do think what happens though is once the uploading takes place, and this then raises a very interesting issue, right? It's going to be being executed, right? This program that includes the memory tape is going to be executed in a machine that then will carry on, right? That then will continue living. And what that means, of course, is it will then acquire new memories, new data, new information, especially if it's interacting with other beings, both cyber beings and biological beings, right? And so this uploaded consciousness isn't just going to stay static, right? It is going to change too. It is going to evolve as well. And in fact, it might even evolve in very massive ways, especially if it's interacting with lots of other things in this kind of form, which is largely informational. Right. And that's one scenario, by the way, how you end up getting super intelligence, right, is by all of these different memory tapes kind of converging in some sort of way and interacting with each other. And so what could happen with the uploading is that the individuality of the person may be lost. It's not just about the body disappearing, but in fact, the individuality of the consciousness might disappear, right? It might merge with other consciousnesses, right? I mean, that is a real possibility in this kind of scenario. And so, and people have different views about that, I have to say. And one context, I don't know if you've read my discussions of this kind of thing, but I think it's worth pointing out to your viewers, you some of them may know about it already, is the idea of the digital afterlife, right? And the idea of digital legacy and things like this, right? So this is getting to be a big deal, and I had another PhD student who wrote a book about this this idea of the digital afterlife, and so it's based on the idea that independently, because you think about how do you extract this information that constitutes our consciousness, and you might imagine some kind of Neuralink thing going on. But of course, the fact that people are constantly generating data, on social media, right? Text and audio and video, and they're self-curating, right? There's a lot of self-archiving and self-curating that is constantly going on, right? That effectively, the person is as it were, developing a kind of version of themselves, right? And very often they spend more time doing that than they do actually living in the offline world. So in other words, what it means for them to be a person is actually projected on this social media space in a very deep kind of way. And so when these people die, right, that information is there, right? It's there, all the text, all the audio, all the video, right? And that can be uploaded as data into a generative algorithm, right? Which then that's the upload moment. And that then can take on a life of its own. And that's the digital afterlife. And so there are basically companies that will do that, right? That will basically, give you the algorithm, right, for your data. So you give them the data, and they provide the algorithm, and then there will be a digital afterlife of you, right? And this thing will have all kinds of capacities in terms of, transformative capacities, right? So just like, like we see all these deep fake things all the time in video, right? You could you could take the original video and you can make new videos out of it, right? Of you operating, posthumously in lots of different settings, saying things that are kind of in your style, but actually different things. And people are really into it, right? So in other words, the people who supply the data, the people, and usually these are people who are about to die, are very keen on this. And they like the generative aspect of it, right? So they like the fact that they're not just going to be preserved in amber, right? But rather they like the fact that there will be a kind of evolution that will take place, right? Once it's uploaded into the algorithm. The people who don't like it are the loved ones. Right? The loved ones who are left behind, right? They don't mind the idea of having digital dad, but digital dad has got to be the dad that they left, that died, right? So in other words, they don't want a generative algorithm. They just want an algorithm that is able to, produce on demand the stuff as it was. Right? They don't want a generative algorithm that can create new hybrid forms and interactive forms and things like that. And that was something that my student found out, which Deborah Bassett is her name. And this is, I think, a pretty striking thing, right? That the loved ones basically want the version, right, of the dead parent, as they were, right? As they were. Not in some new fancy form, right, after they've been mucking around the internet for a few days, right, and now they, pick up some lingo and jargon and knowledge they didn't have when they were in their biological bodies. Okay, so that's a kind of interesting sort of development, it seems to me, and that I think could cause some interesting kinds of social problems in the future. The more and more it becomes possible to have these digital afterlives created.
I think Black Mirror covers very well exactly the types of things that can go wrong in these scenarios. But as you were just talking about that, I think to me that sort of seems like the point of cryopreservation too, because say you can upload your conscious to a computer and then pass, and when there's another physical body, when the technology comes
I think
about,
that might actually be easier than the way they're doing it in Alcor. Seriously. Right? Because Alcor's still working with the old meat bags.
Well, there's a great idea for a research project pitch. But yeah, coming back to copying memory, the first thing, and I'm sure you know, the first thing that I learned on my psychology course was that memory does not work like a tape.
I know.
It is a very malleable construct.
I know. That's why you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that's why some people think what you need to do is actually emulate the brain, right? So this is because, if you look at, Kurzweil, when he first developed this kind of idea back in the 90s, right? He wasn't thinking about brains. He wasn't. He was really thinking kind of like digital tape. I mean, that was kind of what he was thinking. And Max Moore, who did his PhD at the University of Southern California on this topic, right? He was thinking the same way. It was really digital tape. But if you talk about brain emulation and you emulate so you're emulating the complexity of the neural connections and the way they can kind of reconnect, right? And memory is basically a kind of reconfiguration of this neural space. I think then you get a different kind of look. It's a different kind of look. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are two things that I want to raise here. First being the rise of biological computing. So I'm sure you've seen the news of these small brains grown from brain tissue, human brain tissue. These small brains in Petri dishes that researchers are using to solve tasks. And there's an interesting talk from Andrew Hessel that I shared with you and also with the community where he speaks about the rise of biological computing and people having, in the very near future, people having these desktop biological computers and programming of biological life being the next era of programming, basically. So I think that's very interesting topic to explore. But also, secondly, I wanted to raise that artificial intelligence, in my belief, is not the only other intelligence that we've created or that we're ever going to create. I think from now on, we are going to it's going to be a marketplace of different intelligences. And I'm interested in, developing technologies that enable these intelligences to interact, because in my reasoning, one dominant intelligence or one sole intelligence is less profitable than cooperation of diversity of intelligences. And so I'm interested in developing technologies that will allow these intelligences to interact. So even if we consider the case of Neuralink,
I want to pick up on the biological computing thing, because I think this is really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think that is something worth taking seriously. Okay, these little brains in petri dishes and all that. Okay, it reminds me a little bit. By the way, I have talked about this in an article of mine from a few years ago in AI and Society, and I call it cognitive agriculture, because what this means is that you can cultivate brains, and you got to think about it in terms of the way we cultivate stem cells, and then we can use the stem cells, right, to intervene to create brains, and these brains can be harvested, right? It reminds me a little bit of the Philip K. Dick thing, Minority Report, with the precogs, right, which are basically these brains that are swimming around, right, in a kind of, the movie Minority Report was based on this. I don't know if you remember this with Tom Cruise. This is from about No, 25. It's about 25 years ago. It's a Steven Spielberg film from about 25 years ago called Minority Report, based on a novel by Philip K. Dick, and it's about solving crimes before they happen, and what they do, the thing that they use, their computer, so to speak, is a bunch of specifically cultivated brains that are swimming around in some kind of chemical sauce that allows them to live and interact with each other in this kind of chemical soup, right? And then they come up with stuff. And so it's like it's basically a big biological computer, okay? And the point is that in the future, we might be able to harvest these things. Now, this, I think, will cause a lot of ethical problems. Considering what, people are objecting to using stem cells for purposes of creating livers and kidneys and hearts and things like that. Imagine if we start saying we're going to use stem cells so we can create brains, right? That'll drive all these natural law theorists crazy. But the point is, we may be going in that direction. And one argument for it, by the way, is an environmental argument. That is because regardless of how fallible the human brain is, in fact, it is more efficient in terms of energy use to produce the knowledge and the thinking than it does when compared to a computer, a silicon-based computer. Okay? So the human brain uses a lot less energy to do what it does than a computer would need to do. So, the computers we have, even the ones that we call supercomputers, don't do everything the brain does, right? They do a very particular function of what the brain does, and often does it better than the brain does. But then if you look at those computers, the amount of energy that's required to keep them going on a regular basis is massive in comparison to what the brain requires. Okay? And so, in a sense, if it were possible either to replace silicon computers with these carbon-based biological computers, or to have some kind of more cyborgian merging, we might actually be able to cut the energy costs of computing. Because I think that is going to be that's going to be one thing that, the more and more we're relying on computers, and unless we get something like quantum computing going on, the odds are that we're going to end up blowing the sockets of the planet with the amount of energy that takes to run all these wonderful computers we're talking about. So moving into something biological may make sense from an ecological standpoint, and that would be, for me, a real important argument. Especially if this biological computing research really gets off the ground and starts to show something. It's something to think about.
So on that topic, there's actually a very interesting conversation that was held between Gil Verdon and Peter Diamandis on his podcast on thermodynamic computing. That's already very much in the works. And the cool thing about it is that it could match the energy expenditure of the brain to perform the same amount of compute, but also it could function at the temperature of the brain's environment, which was my click to the idea that there's going to be some sort of cooperation between.
Well, that itself would be a big improvement if computers could function at the temperature of the brain. Yeah, that would definitely cut some energy costs already.
Yeah, so there seems to be like a push from both sides, from the biological side and from the artificiality side, if you will.
Yeah.
But this problem of energy expense keeps circling me back to the debate around Elon Musk we just had, which is energy expense seems to be this, pressurizing factor on innovation. We need a greater level of intelligence to survive in this world today, and that requires, more energy to compute, and which requires us to seek other sources of energy. And that's how we, naturally go from type 0 to type 1 as per the Kardashev scale. And when, I speak on these topics to various people, some would say, this is not natural, we should halt advancements, we should pull the plug. But to me, that doesn't seem like a logical argument. To me, this seems like just this is the natural next step. Our cognition is a byproduct of authentic evolution, if you will, and our cognition has come up with this social structure. Maybe it's not the best, but it's the best that we could agree on collectively. And these are the technologies that are natural byproducts of our cognition.
Okay, well, so I do a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. I teach in a law course, and I was mentioning a couple of minutes ago about natural law theory, because natural law theory, in a way, is predicated on this point that you're making, that there's a strong distinction between nature and artificial, and that nature is good and artificial is bad, right? And so in fact, I don't know if again you may not recall this, but about 20 years ago now, there was a George W. Bush commissioned a bioethics panel about stem cell research and about whether the federal government, the United States federal government, should be supporting stem cell research, and it concluded no. Right. And so federally funded stem cell research was banned. I mean, stem cell research could still be done through private funding, through the individual states, but the federal government will not fund that. That was the ruling. And the guy who ran the panel was a famous natural law theorist, right? Guy named Leon Kass, Kass. And he wrote a very famous article that appeared in I believe it was Nation magazine. It was called The Wisdom of Repugnance. Okay, The Wisdom of Repugnance. And what and this was his test about, so he believes natural is good, artificial is bad, right? The test of whether something is natural is whether when you look at it, you say, okay, that's fine, or you say, yuck, that's awful. And so and that's his test, right? That there is a kind of instinctive moral instinct about what is permissible and not permissible. And so his argument was that if you actually tell people how stem cell research works, and that you need a lot of stem cells in order to get anything to work, and so effectively all of these potential life forms are being slaughtered, right? This is how he puts it, right? Then people would say, yuck, right? And even after that, if you told them, well, what effectively stem cell research does is it grows organs, and you can say which organ you want to grow, basically. And people will say, yuck, that is weird, And so he said that's a very reliable test, right, about our moral disposition. And this actually carried the day. My point is this carried the day, and it's still very much used. So if you look at the Roman Catholic Church, for example, right, which is basically the bastion of natural law theory, this is how they argue, right? And so they are arguing with this very strong, not only a strong sense of natural versus artificial, but one that is in some sense instinctive, right? That we can tell intuitively that if something is just not good, it is wrong. Okay? Now, Jesus, this is, what can I say? The point is that there are people who buy this. Okay? I'm just saying that's the level. It seems to me that very often this is kind of the level at which one needs to deal with the argument. And I think the fact that transhumanism, to such a large extent, is often associated with and motivated by science fiction concerns, right? The science fiction side of transhumanism, I don't think does it any favors in this kind of context, right? Because all these natural law theorists are going to say, look, these are just science fiction freaks, right? And they want to turn the world into what they're reading in these science fiction books. And it's not natural. They can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality, right? I mean, so those arguments will start to come in, right? Precisely because it in a way, it draws on this kind of stereotype of what transhumanists are like, right? And so the weirdness of it, which often a lot of transhumanists seem to valorize, actually ends up being used as an argument against them. And so that is an issue that I think as we go forward, we're going to have to deal with in a much more direct way, that in some sense, all of these radical transformations that we're talking about that blur the boundary between the artificial and the natural will need to be normalized. Let's put it that way, need to be normalized so that people don't find it so repugnant. right? And they're not so easily moved by those kinds of arguments.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these fears, might fade once people start to acquire like hands-on experiences of these enhancements and technologies. So a good example of this is the Neuralink, human trials where they had the patient up on stage and, well, they did the demo, but then there was a round of questions. And of course, the most pressing question from the audience was, well, what's the experience like? How do you actually control, what was the feeling of controlling that mouse with your thoughts? And, he couldn't describe it. It's just an internal perspective. And I think as more people start to acquire these subjective experiences of these enhancements and technologies, then they will warm up to the ideas better, and it might actually fade some of this objective criticism. Steve, I'm really sorry. I'm just conscious of time. I'm afraid that we might be running out of it. I don't have eyes on the server, so it might cut out automatically, which is what I'm afraid of. However, this has been such an incredible discussion that I would love to continue it with you. And so we actually,
sure, of course,
on our server host these movie nights where we can run the stream of the movie and have a discussion parallel. And I thought that your suggestion of that Tom Cruise film would be a great thing.
Yeah, it's easy to find. It's easy to find.
Yeah, so if you're open to it, please come by, and you don't have to be in the studio. No camera, no mic. It's just text-based discussion.
Are you in London? Are you in London?
I am, yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, sure.
So yeah, it would be great to have you there with us and contribute your perspectives on the movie to the community. But Steve, this has been such an eye-opening conversation, and I can't wait to continue it with you. I wish you all the best until we meet again.
All right. Thank you, Kirill. Thank you. And thank you, everybody online.